very excited and honored to host Helen McVeigh. Many of you, of course, know Helen as the founder of HM Classics Academy. Helen holds a master's degree in classics from Queen's University Belfast, and HM Classics Academy began as the Belfast Summer School in Latin and Classical Greek in 2016, and it has grown to include weekly online courses in a variety of ancient languages and topics around the ancient world throughout the academic year. Helen is also a former chair of the Central Council of the Classical Association of Northern Ireland and a trustee of the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies. I'm going to turn it over to Helen now, and I will have my email and our website in the chat for anyone who has any questions or would like to request information. There you go, Helen.
Thank you very much indeed, Irene, for that lovely warm welcome. And I've just put in the chat, it's so lovely to see so many faces and names that I recognize. So I shall share my screen and bear with me while I not going to work. Okay, so thank you very much, Irene, for inviting me today. I'm really delighted to be here and tell you all about the ancient novels. So I hope you will enjoy finding out about the ancient novels, and I'll maybe convert you to finding
So
out.
it's a Cumberland sausage sandwich.
Finding out more about them and maybe reading them yourselves. So they lived happily ever after. So we're all familiar with fairy tales ending in this way, and such a conclusion provides us with a sigh of relief, contentment, and satisfaction. And all 5 of the surviving ancient Greek novels close with a happy ending where the protagonists are reunited and all is well. So in this seminar, we'll find out more about the little known genre of ancient Greek fiction, their plots and their characterization, and investigate the novelists themselves. So as a student a long time ago, it came as a surprise to me to learn that the ancient Greeks had written novels. We're familiar with the philosophy of Plato and the tragedies of Euripides, Sophocles and Aeschylus, the epic poems of Homer, and maybe we associate early novels with Don Quixote or Robinson Crusoe. But the result of a quick Google search for the first novel gives us an 11th century Japanese text entitled The Tale of Genji. So I'm not familiar with that. But what about the ancient Greek novels then? Did they exist? What sets them apart from Plato, Homer, and the rest? Well, first we need to clarify what actually constitutes a novel. So a novel is a work of prose fiction. It's not a myth. A myth is a traditional story, typically concerning the early history of a people and involving supernatural beings or events. For example, the myth of Prometheus. Nor is it a legend. This is also a traditional story and is regarded as historical, but has not been authenticated. For example, the legend of King Arthur. So in ancient Greek literature, verse was used for imaginative purposes, epic, drama, poetry, while prose was used for history or philosophy. In other words, a collection of information. So what is different about the novels is that they are extended stories, imaginative literature created in prose. The 5 ancient Greek novels, there are 5 ancient Greek novels that survive. Sometimes they're called romances. And these 5 novels were written between the 1st and 4th centuries AD. It's believed that the novelist Charatone was writing around 50 AD, followed in the 2nd century by Xenophon of Ephesus, Longus, and Achilles Tatius, while the latest work by Heliodorus has been dated to the 4th century AD, that's the 300s. The scholar Nicholas Holtzberg states that the Greek novel is an entirely fictitious story, narrated in prose and ruled in its course by erotic motifs and a series of adventures, which mostly take place during a journey and which can be differentiated into a number of specific fixed patterns. The protagonists live in a realistically portrayed world, which, even when set by the author in an age-long past, essentially reflects everyday life around the Mediterranean in late Hellenistic and imperial societies. So forgive me for the long quote, but it's very useful to set the scene. So these novels are seen to form a coherent group because of the recurring themes they share. And the underlying structure of the novels is based around the lover's search for the beloved after the enforced separation of the couple, who have overcome an initial obstacle to get married. Both undergo their own adventures until the grand finale, the reunion, and then they return to their native land. So the motifs common to all 5 novels are, we've got the protagonists are usually a young man and a young woman from distinguished families. He is incredibly handsome and she is often compared to a goddess, so both very beautiful. They set out on a long journey to far off lands, either together or separately. They undergo a series of harrowing experiences. So the most frequent cause of their troubles is their mutual pledge of unswerving fidelity. They're frequently in danger of being murdered, and sometimes it appears that they have actually died, and they may be kidnapped by robbers or pirates or shipwrecked. And there are threats to their chastity, both the boy and the girl. And at the end of their ordeals, the couple are reunited and return home, and they live happily ever after. So the text that we think is the earliest is by Caratone. And here is a short summary, which I've also put on a slide for you, because there's a lot happens. And I should say there's a trigger warning. I'm not sure if it's off the top of the screen there, for domestic violence. So our hero and heroine, Kyrios and Callirrhoe, meet in Syracuse on the island of Sicily. Love at first sight, they bump into each other and the two marry. Kyrios, however, is led to believe that Callirrhoe has been unfaithful, and he kicks her and she falls unconscious, appearing to be dead. There we have that motif of the apparent death. And she's buried with a lavish funeral. She awakens then inside the tomb because she's not really, how could she be dead? You know, we're expecting this happy ending. So she awakens inside the tomb as pirates are breaking in. She's sold as a slave to a nobleman called Dionysius in the Greek city of Miletus. So Miletus is on the west coast of Turkey, so Asia Minor. Dionysius falls in love with her. This is a recurring theme. She's very beautiful. Everyone falls in love with her. And she marries him. She's already married to Kyrios, but she marries Dionysius. And she discovers that she is pregnant with Kyrios' child. Meanwhile, Kyrios searches for Callirrhoe. He discovers that she's gone from the tomb. And he then is enslaved in Miletus, coincidence, by Mithridates, who has also fallen in love with Callirrhoe. So at the moment, we've got Kyrios, Mithridates, and Dionysius. We've got 3 important, influential men in love with her. Kyrios then writes to Callirrhoe, but the letter is intercepted by Dionysius, and a case of attempted adultery against Kyrios' master is brought before the Persian king. Kyrios' master, remember, is Mithridates. The king falls in love with Callirrhoe, of course he does, and he attempts to detain her in Babylon by postponing his decision about which man Callirrhoe is legally married to. The situation is interrupted by an Egyptian revolt, and Kyrios joins the Egyptian army. He thinks that Callirrhoe has been awarded to Dionysius. Callirrhoe is then captured and presented as a trophy to the Egyptian admiral, who turns out to be Kyrios, and they are reunited. They return to Syracuse. They live happily ever after. So lots and lots going on there. It's fast paced. And, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. How on earth is the author going to resolve all these threads? Okay, the other novels then, there are another 4. So a quick look at the plots of the other novels reveals them to be strikingly similar. If we start off with the Ephesian story on the left there by Xenophon of Ephesus, very similar to the subject matter of Caratone's novel. A boy and a girl meet at a religious festival, marry, are separated, apparent death, travel, adventure, pirates, enslavement, reunion. And it's very fast moving, even more so than Caratone's novel. There's not much description or character development, and it's divided into 5 books. But there is an entry in the Suda, the 10th century encyclopedia, that states that Xenophon's novel is 10 books in length. So it's possible that what we have in 5 books is a summary of the longer 10-book novel. Achilles Tatius, second from the right there, the pictures for you to look at while I'm talking. So we've got Leucippe and Cleitophon, written in the first person, which is unusual. It alters the reader's perspective. The couple meet at the beginning of the novel. Travel and adventure threaten chastity. Pirates, robbers, apparent death, enslavement, and they are married at the end of the novel. Longus, Daphnis and Chloe by Longus. This novel is a little bit different. It lacks the travel element. There is no separation of the couple, and instead it focuses on the psychological development of the protagonists. It tells the story of a boy and girl adopted by different sets of parents who grow up shepherding together. They're not noble, but eventually both are reclaimed by their high status biological parents and they marry. Finally, Heliodorus, an Ethiopian romance or an Ethiopian story. Heliodorus, this is a really complex work. Heliodorus uses the technique of flashback, so borrowed from the Odyssey. It's a Odyssean. We meet a young couple in the middle of their adventure, and we learn the events leading up to this point through conversations with the people that they meet. Sometimes a flashback occurs within a flashback. It's very complex, and I would actually recommend you read it with pen and paper, because I had to take notes of who was who, what was happening. There's a lot going on. It's very complicated. The novel contains the usual elements, though. We've got apparent death, robbers, threats to chastity, but also magic and zombies. So, you know, a little bit of everything there. Something for Halloween as well. The story ends, of course, with a reunion and a wedding. Given the similarity of the Ethiopian story to Homer's Odyssey in structure, and indeed the adventure and romantic elements of the Odyssey, the separation of Odysseus and Penelope and their happy reunion at the conclusion, we can see the correspondences between the novels and the Homeric epic, and that's something I will come back to later on. So about the novelists themselves, we know very little other than what they tell us in their texts. But Heliodorus closes his novel with a short biography. He says, "So concludes the Ethiopica, the story of Theagenes and Chariclea, the work of a Phoenician from the city of Emesa, one of the clan of descendants of the sun, Theodosius' son, S-O-N, Heliodorus, gift of the sun, Heliodorus. Emesa is in Syria, and it's speculated that this novel was written in the 4th century, around 360. And by 400 AD, a certain Heliodorus was a bishop of the Thessalian church. So was it a common name? Who knows? Was it the same person? We've no idea. So Heliodorus concludes his work with the biographical information, but Caratone begins his novel with the following. "My name is Caratone," there it is on the screen, "of Aphrodisias. I am clerk to the lawyer Athenagoras. I'm going to tell you the story of a love affair that took place in Syracuse." That is all we know about him. So frustrating. He introduces himself and he's telling you the purpose of his work. Now we're going to compare the opening words of Herodotus' histories. Down here, Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry. And then Thucydides begins with, Thucydides the Athenian wrote the history of the war fought between Athens and Sparta. They introduce themselves, who they are, what they're going to do, just like Caratone does. Only Caratone introduces his novel in this way, but it's fitting for his novel because his story is set historically in the 5th century BC, so approximately 500 years before he lived. And it features historical, though anachronistically chosen characters. We've got Hermocrates, the Sicilian general. He is Callirhoe's father, the Sicilian general who defeated the Athenians. Do you remember him from Thucydides? And the Persian king is Artaxerxes, possibly inspired by Artaxerxes II. But those two historical figures, I think they overlap ever so slightly, but not enough that they really existed at the same time. So Caratone presents his tale as a history, including appropriately chosen characters in terms of the rough chronology. The story is presented as true with no fantastical elements. Okay. Excuse me. So, who might have read the ancient novels? Well, perhaps the question should be who consumed the ancient novels, because a reader needs to be literate. And in order to be literate, one must receive an education. And there is no evidence to suggest that regular instruction for boys was also available for girls in the 5th century BC. I know he wasn't writing in the 5th century BC, but just talking about literacy, there was regular instruction for boys, but not for girls. But we have these vase paintings. I think one of these has been identified as a muse, but they show what look like Athenian women holding papyrus rolls. Are they reading? Possibly. Plato's Protagoras states that it was male children who were educated and attended school, but also that education began in the home by the nurse, the mother, the tutor, and the father himself. So according to Plato, education is the teaching of, this education in the home is the teaching of what is just or unjust, noble or base, holy or unholy, rather than literacy and numeracy, which can wait until the child goes to school. In Economics 9, Xenophon, moving to Xenophon, he reports that a female housekeeper was able to read instructions in order to disseminate tasks to the rest of the staff. Isomachus, the character, the man in economics, the house owner, says that the items that we use, we handed over to the housekeeper, and after she made a written inventory of all the items. We told her to give them out to the right servants, to remember what she gave to each of them, and when receiving them back, to put everything in the place from which she took it. So that does sound like the housekeeper needed to keep some sort of written list of items. So I think we should assume that certainly in 5th century BC classical Greece, while women may have been educated to a limited degree, this was more likely to have happened in the home for the purpose of maybe perhaps teaching their own sons and possibly daughters, or was necessitated by employment. Now, Caratone's heroine, Callirhoe, is herself papaidumene, which means to be educated or the result of education. The concept of paideia from papaidumene. Paideia can be translated as educated, cultured, and well-bred. It includes other characteristics such as sophrosune, self-control, and the resultant general good character. So, Callirhoe is a gune papaidumene kai Phreneres, a polite and intelligent woman, and a cultured Greek woman. Those are the translations from Gould in the Loeb edition. She also, if you remember, received a letter. Well, the letter was intercepted. Kyrios was writing her a letter. The letter was intercepted, but if he was writing her a letter, it contained information about her first husband that would have been dangerous for someone else to read. You know, it was for her eyes only. So I would suggest that she was able to read and the letter was meant for her. Okay. So it may not have been necessary to be literate in order to enjoy Caratone's texts. And there are other ways, going back to our text of the novel, there are other ways in which it might have been transmitted. In Lucian's Peri Orcheseos, which is a defense of the Roman art of pantomime, the character Crato is being forced by his friend Lycinus to watch pantomimic dancing, in which a dramatic plot was performed by a masked and costumed dancer, accompanied by an actor. Female characters were played by men, and Crato complains particularly about the female impersonators. A girlish fellow plays the wanton with dainty clothing and bawdy songs and imitates lovesick minxes, the most erotic of all antiquity, such as Phaedra and Parthenope and Rhodope. Why am I telling you this? Well, we know Phaedra was the wife of Theseus. Rhodope is probably a character from Thrace who married her brother. The couple compared themselves to Zeus and Hera, and apparently were turned into mountains for their insolence. But most interesting for us is Parthenope. Who is Parthenope? Well, she is the heroine of a lost novel, possibly written by Caratone, conjectured to have been authored by Caratone. But Parthenope's beloved is Metaicus the Phrygian, and the characters are celebrated on this beautiful mosaic. And if you look closely, you can see the character on the right. We can see the mu, the eta, the tau, Metaicus, that says. And I know there's a lacuna there. We can't see all the letters, but it begins with pi and alpha. Surely that's Metaicus and Parthenope. This mosaic was on display in the museum in Gaziantep in Turkey. And actually, I meant to Google to find out what has happened to this, because Gaziantep is where the earthquake was a lot of months ago. I'm not sure how long ago that was, if you can remember that. But hopefully the mosaic is safe. So the ancient romances themselves are full of theatrical and performative elements, even audiences within the novel. The characters in Caratone's novel appear publicly in assemblies, on stage, if you like. There are public gatherings in Syracuse and in Babylon. And there is an assembly in Book 1 during which the demos, the people, urge Callirrhoe's father, Hermocrates, to agree that she should be married to Kyrios. And there's also a concluding assembly during which Callirrhoe briefly appears before the people, and then Kyrios relates their adventures. So it's sort of bookended by assemblies. The assembly in Book 1 decides that Kyrios and Callirrhoe, they've fallen in love, decides that they should be married, and then they're welcomed home again at the end. There's also a beauty contest between Callirrhoe and the most beautiful of the Persian noble women. Her name is Rhodogone. There was high tension and excitement in the packed Babylonian courtroom, almost like, I don't know, a bit like Blind Date. That's going back a bit for UK people, Cilla Black. Who will Callirrhoe be awarded to? Will she be awarded to Kyrios or to Dionysius? And Caratone poses rhetorical questions at that point. He says, who might be worthy of describing that scene in the courtroom? What sort of dramatist would introduce such an incredible story on stage? Who? Well, obviously it's going to be Caratone himself, because he continues with the story to tell us what's happening. So of course, so we're suggesting that there may have been, that the story may have been acted in some sort of pantomime. People may not, the consumers of the novel may not have been able to read. It may not have been necessary for them to read in order to be part of their audience. So we enjoy holding and reading books, don't we? It's always a treat to have a new book. But most of us have e-readers and Kindles, and even I have been converted to audiobooks. And our busy lives require us to multitask, yet we can still enjoy consuming a book while doing something else. And this points to another way in which the readers of the ancient Greek novels might have enjoyed the stories. The novels may have been read aloud to those who could not read, just as, for example, Christian texts were read for illiterate congregations. But even the shortest novel is too long for public recitation in one sitting. So I'm going to suggest to you that there's evidence in Caratone's novel that it could have been serialized and published in installments. We're frequently provided with summaries of what has gone before, both in the narrator's voice and the voices in his characters. So perhaps he intended that his novel would appeal to those who might not have been able to afford to purchase the work in its entirety, or, you know, then they could read it in installments, or perhaps it could have been read publicly in installments. So Caratone's novel has 8 books. It's divided into 8 books. Immediately precisely in the middle of the work, the opening of book 5, we have a lengthy detailed recapitulation. And this summary attempts to condense a large amount of material and is for the most part accurate. It certainly provides enough information for a reader to continue onwards from book 5 and comprehend the plot. So the recap, I think, suggests a novel in at least 2 volumes, necessitating an introduction and recapitulation at the beginning of maybe the second papyrus roll in which the work was recorded. And I think this suggestion is corroborated by the Florentine manuscript, which records Callirrhoe in its entirety. So book 5 in this manuscript is prefaced with the words, ton peri Kyrie and kai Callirrhoe eroticon diagematon. I shouldn't have read that in Greek. It means the love story about Kyrios and Callirrhoe. It's like a little heading before we continue into the work. So this opening to book 5, followed as it is by a detailed recapitulation, I think is strong evidence to support the argument that this book commenced a second papyrus. And given the substantial number of summaries in the novel, both by the author and the characters, it's not implausible to suggest that it may have been divided into even shorter segments, which may have been sold in installments or was suitable for a reader to deliver aloud to others who were unable to read the work for themselves. So yes, summaries occur regularly and provide a synopsis of previous events. It's the sort of thing we might see at the beginning of a new episode of a TV serial to remind the audience of what has happened so far. And I like that still, because it's so dramatic. It's important for the reader to recollect this is the information that the reader needs to know before they continue into the forthcoming installment. Alternatively, such regularly spaced summaries might indicate that the intended audience of the text were not accustomed to reading a fairly lengthy text, or were perhaps new to reading as a leisure activity. But what about the highly educated reader? Would they have been attracted to reading a novel whose subject matter might be mocked today as being light-hearted, easy reading popular fiction? Well, I suggest yes. Caratone wrote his novel for the very purpose of intriguing the educated reader, including Easter eggs for them to find. So by Easter eggs, I mean those little extras that are hidden for readers to find, allusions. So apologies for the information here. In Calaroe, there are many Homeric references. I thought, you know, I had to bring Homer into this somehow, and I thought this group would appreciate that. There are so many Homeric references and even direct quotations from the Odyssey and the Iliad. So if we look at the Trojan War myth and how these elements correspond to the novel, we can see that it's quite a lot. So Helen is wooed and marries Menelaus. Same with Calaroe, she marries Charius. That's not too strange. It's maybe a common theme in fiction. Helen is awarded to Paris by Aphrodite. Aphrodite introduces Calaroe to Dionysius, and Tyche affects the marriage. Chance, the goddess Chance, affects the marriage. Perhaps that's a coincidence that there's divine intervention. Next point, Menelaus and his allies seek Helen. Charius and his friend Polycarmus search for Calaroe. Calaroe has been abducted to Asia Minor, and off they go to find her. Well, I think at this point it's no longer a coincidence. The heroine has been abducted and their husbands are contriving to bring them home. Then we've got a 10-year Trojan War. In Calaroe, we've got a trial. War breaks out. Contests to win Helen or Calaroe. So there's either one 10-year war, or in Calaroe we've got the trial and then the war breaks out. Finally, the Trojans are defeated and Menelaus and Helen are reunited and they return home, possibly to live happily ever after. Charius becomes a successful commander on the side of the Egyptians and is reunited with Calaroe. They do live happily ever after. So to delve a little bit deeper, are we agreed? Can we say we're agreed that the plot resembles the abduction of Helen by Paris? I think so. But is there anything else that's similar? Well, the relationship between Charius and his friend Polycarmus is modeled on, I suggest, is modeled on the friendship of Achilles and Patroclus. They're very close. I'm not going to suggest that there's a love affair going on there, but they are close, good friends, and they're willing to die for one another. Calaroe herself is portrayed as a combination of Penelope, the faithful wife, and Helen, abducted to a foreign country to become the illegitimate wife of another. Now, I say she's the faithful wife, but she has married another, and that's tricky. She's married to Dionysius, and he believes that she's had his child. But there are other reasons why she marries him, and we're not going to. We could go down a rabbit hole there, but we're not going to. There's also the novelistic element of the Odyssey, with the protagonist's adventures, liberation of his wife from marriage to one of her suitors, and the couple's happy reunion. And Charius adheres to a heroic code in the final books of the novel. Once he believes that Calaroe is no longer in his sights, that she has been awarded to another, he no longer fears death. And so he goes off to fight and he becomes a Homeric hero. So in Caratone's novel, there are at least 34 unique quotations from Homer, 19 from the Iliad and 15 from the Odyssey. And the quotes are found in settings equivalent to the Homeric context from which they have been procured. So for example, Charius appears to Calaroe in a dream, and he is described by using the lines with which Homer portrays the ghost of Patroclus. So there you can see, I've just given you a translation in English in case we don't have the Greek. We've got in all likeness for stature and the lovely eyes and voice and wore such clothing. It's exactly the same. In all his likeness for stature and the lovely eyes. The Greek is identical. So Iliad, Book 2. Hector is about to leave the relative safety of the city of Troy to fight Achilles. His parents are begging him not to leave since he is going to certain death. And in a last-ditch attempt to persuade Hector not to go ahead, his mother opens her robe and reminds her son how she nursed him as a baby. She is distraught, mourning for him already. She says, Hector, my child, look upon these and obey, and take pity on me if ever I gave you the breast to quiet your sorrow. Meanwhile, though, in Callirrhoe, Chaereas is about to sail away from Syracuse in search of his wife. While dangerous, the journey will not end in the certain death which Hector was about to face. Chaereas' mother is overreacting and overwhelming. She wants to accompany him on the journey and even says he can throw her overboard if she becomes troublesome. She repeats the same words that Hecuba says to Hector, son, have respect for these and take pity upon me. So the difference is the nature of these two heroes. Hector is the bravest of the Trojans, their absolute hero, and he refuses to withdraw, preparing for his duel with Achilles. But by contrast, Chaereas, he can't cope. He throws himself overboard to escape his mother's pleas. He lacks the courage to challenge her and prefers to die than choose between pleasing his parents and searching for his wife. He puts the sailors in danger because they jump in to rescue him, and a scuffle ensues in the water as Chaereas rejects her help. It's very visual and it's chaotic. But the educated reader, one who's very familiar with the Iliad and the Odyssey, will appreciate the contrast that is being made. Chaereas is being compared unfavorably with Hector. Contrast the heroism of Hector with the cowardly Chaereas, unable to confront uncomfortable situations. Chaereas does not earn his kleos, his glory, until Book 7, when he finally has nothing left to live for. He believes Callirrhoe has been awarded by the Persian king to Dionysius. Once he is no longer afraid of death, he becomes like the Homeric hero. He is in command of the Egyptian army, playing a central role in the progress of the war, and he is highly respected by all his troops. While the distribution of quotations such as this might appear random, Chaereas chooses to use quotations at moments of high drama. So as Chaereas goes into battle, Chaereas quotes from Hector's monologue as he begins his final encounter with Achilles, knowing that he is about to die. Believing that Callirrhoe has been awarded to Dionysius and that she is out of his reach for good, Chaereas no longer fears death. So by attributing Hector's words to Chaereas, his status, heroism, and kleos are raised to that of a Homeric hero. So both these characters say, let me at least not die without a struggle, inglorious, but do some big thing first, that men to come shall know of it. Our heroine, Callirrhoe, is frequently referred to as a prize, an athlon, in a contest, an agon. Her suitors, yes, she has suitors just like Penelope, they're angry that Chaereas has carried off the athlon, the prize. They point out that Chaereas is competing with kings. Mithridates hopes to carry off the prize himself. The Persian noblewomen set up a beauty contest. Dionysius is competing for his wife. So all these expressions recall the competitive and ultimately destructive mindset which prevails in the Iliad, in particular the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon and the fates of Chryses and Briseis. Moreover, such oratory of conflict evokes the capture of Helen by Paris and the ensuing battle between nations, with Helen as the trophy to be claimed. When the trial in Babylon brings publicity for the participants, the entire populace voices an opinion and claims a side. So the trial at which the king, Artaxerxes, is going to award Callirrhoe to either her first husband or her second husband. So Mithridates fears major political and military unrest like that of the campaign to recover Helen, and even considers a plan to lead a revolt against the king. Concurrent with these thoughts, Dionysius remembers ancient stories which told of the inconstant ways of beautiful women. Despite not mentioning her name, it is implied that Dionysius is referring to Helen. And to prepare the reader for the high drama of the trial, a number of furtive remarks such as this occur in Book 4. These are voiced by Dionysius, by the narrator, and by Callirrhoe herself, who says that, like Helen, she has become the gossip of Asia and Europe. Dionysius regrets having brought Callirrhoe to Babylon, where there are many men like Paris who seek to steal the wives of others. Dionysius fears that, like Menelaus, he will be unable to keep his wife safe. It was risky and short-sighted to bring Callirrhoe to Babylon, he says, where there are many men like Mithridates. Menelaus could not keep Helen safe in respectable Sparta. There is many a man like Paris in Persia. So this quotation demonstrates how Dionysius sees himself as a Menelaus figure. The character of Callirrhoe remains fairly constant in her portrayal as a doublet of Helen and Penelope, while the characterization of her male counterparts fluctuates. Dionysius begins as the Paris character by being the second husband who lives in Asia Minor, and Chaereas is the Menelaus counterpart, seeking to retrieve his wife from the usurper. I'm seeing the time. I'll try and close up. In the narrative surrounding the moments when Callirrhoe is exposed to public view in Babylon, Caratone quotes directly from a scene in Iliad 3, during which Helen joins the Trojan elders to view the duel between Paris and Menelaus on the plain below. Like Helen's appearance on the walls of Troy in the presence of the old men, Callirrhoe appears before the populace and is closely inspected. To reinforce the parallel, Caratone uses a quotation from Iliad 3, and he says, "She looked just as the divine poet describes Helen when she appears to them that were about Priam and Panthus and also Thymoetes. As Helen approaches them, the Trojan elders discuss her, murmuring among themselves. And meanwhile, Callirrhoe's beauty is further emphasized by the inclusion of a quote from the Odyssey. They all prayed for the prize of sleeping beside her. So she's a commodity. She's just a prize." Okay. At the end of the novel, as was conventional, the lovers are reunited. There has already been a revelation scene in the courtroom. Chaereas appears, but they will not be restored to one another until Book 8. Their eventual reunification evokes the scene between Penelope and Odysseus in Odyssey 23. Penelope steps over the threshold into the room where Odysseus is waiting. And in a similar manner, Chaereas steps over the threshold to the room occupied by Callirrhoe, and both couples spend the night swapping stories. Both scenes contain the same line: they gladly went together to bed in their old ritual. So by embellishing the narrative with an extract from Homer's account of the culmination of Odysseus' wanderings, Caratone equates his characters to Penelope and Odysseus. It is not typical of the novelistic genre to incorporate citations like this, and neither Xenophon of Ephesus nor Longus include quotations from other authors. Heliodorus and Achilles Tatius contain a few direct quotes from Homer, Hesiod, Euripides, and Bacchylides. However, quotations are much more plentiful in Caratone. And the development of the plot follows the Trojan War myth, in particular, the account represented in the Homeric epics. So Caratone uses these analogies with the Homeric poems to communicate with his educated readership. He establishes a dialogue with his readers. He does not formally present the majority of his quotations as originating from Homer, but he leaves the reader to identify them himself through recognition either of the source or of the alteration in the rhythm of the prose. He appeals to his audience by using a familiar storyline and suggesting a shared experience, a comparable educational background, and an interest in the epic poems. I recently read a book by Northern Irish author Michael Hughes, which is set during the Northern Irish Troubles. His characters and their actions are based on the characters in Homer's Iliad. And as a big fan of the Iliad, this was fun to read because the recognition of the Homeric characters was highly entertaining. And while I was reading it, I thought about how the ancient readers might have responded to the quotations and allusions in Caratone's novel. But those readers who were perhaps unfamiliar with the Homeric texts and did not recognize the quotes or allusions, they could still appreciate the fast-paced and exciting tale. They would have been unaware of the nuances of the text and the layers of meaning which Caratone was suggesting. The citations bring satisfaction to the educated reader and heightens suspense, and their identification brings enjoyment and exhilaration to the reading experience. So to conclude, I believe that the ancient Greek novels have something for everyone. Some may be scornful of the novels because of their simplistic plots. And I agree that the earliest novels, Caratone and Xenophon of Ephesus, they are less sophisticated than the later novels, but this just demonstrates the evolution of the genre. Certainly when we reach Heliodorus' Ethiopian story, the movement of the plot is increasingly complex. The Greek novels are 2,000-year-old stories, which were probably enjoyed by ordinary people seeking a little escapism after a long day at work. The characters in the stories were created to appeal to the readers, and the plots are thrilling and suspenseful, and I highly recommend them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to stop the recording now so that we can take some questions if anybody has any.